All right, we want to go ahead and talk a little bit today about imperialism, or as sometimes you'll read about it, called expansionism. The two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. I think the more popular term today is probably imperialism, but again, it has been referred to as both. The period that we're talking about here in U.S. history is approximately 1880 to 1915, so we're talking about right at the turn of the century. And the idea behind imperialism is the idea that you're going out and exerting your influence or conquering other countries in order for the purposes of building an empire. And again, you can do this in a couple different ways. You can do this using military means. That's the most overt way. You go out and you take your army and it's bigger and stronger than somebody else's, and you subdue them. More frequently during the 1880s to 1915 is probably practiced using political or economic means. Political pressure in the sense of going out and trying to force people into treaties that are favorable to your own nation, so you exert influence over other countries in that regard, or economically. Today, people would probably look at the United States as an imperial power because of our economic policies. Mickey Mouse, Coca-Cola, Levi jeans, they precede our presence and they influence other countries because other countries want to buy our stuff and we buy their stuff. So we can exert our influence over other nations in that way as well. And that is also sometimes referred to as a type of imperialism. Why do countries do this? Why did they go out and try to expand their influence around the world in the 1880s through 1915 in particular? One was because a lot of your countries were becoming very industrialized and they were producing, in fact, overproducing goods. And so they needed places to sell them. That's called a market. They needed a market for their goods. And so a lot of people were looking to go ahead and open up new markets where they could sell stuff. Also, as they're making more and more stuff, that means they need more and more raw materials with which to make things. And so you're looking to go ahead and secure access to certain raw materials, and many of them found in different places around the world. So you want to go out and you want to make sure that certain areas, for instance, China, you have access to for markets and you have raw materials from there. And the third motivation is probably a little bit darker. It's a racist motivation. The Europeans had come to believe in evolution, in Darwin, and the survival of the fittest, that the strong survive. And they said if that applies to organisms, to nature, does it then also apply to human society? Do the best societies, the strongest societies, those societies that thrive, is there something about them that is inherently better than societies which are falling or are failing? And they believed that there was. And so at the time, European society was ascendant, it was moving upwards, it was expanding around the globe. And so they said, hey, European society, particularly British society, must be superior because we are the ones that are winning right now. And so it was this belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority that European culture, in particular British culture, was better than any culture around the world. And so, hey, look how nice we are. Aren't we awesome? We're going to teach, since our culture's better, we're going to teach everybody to be just like us. And that was one of the ideas, one of the motivations for going out and expanding around the globe. One of the guys who really influenced the United States in this regard was a gentleman by the name of Admiral Alfred Mahan. He wrote a book. The book was called The Influence of Seapower on History from 1660 to 1783. Mahan said that if the United States wanted to become a world power, he didn't advocate that we necessarily should, although I think he certainly believed that we should. But if we wanted to become a world power, there were certain things that we needed. We needed a modern fleet. We needed to build a canal across Panama to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets. We needed bases in the Caribbean with which to protect this Panama Canal. And we needed a base somewhere in the Pacific, preferably halfway, and he recommended Hawaii. Uh, Teddy Roosevelt read his book, and we do all of those things. He has a huge impact on the foreign policy of the United States, and we'll study that throughout the remainder of this unit. In fact, here you have an excerpt of the text. This is actually the first paragraph in the introduction that he wrote to the Influence of Seapower upon History. If you'd like to go ahead and read it, just go ahead and click pause right now, and you can go ahead and take a quick look at what Mahan was proposing. This is basically the purpose of his book, according to him. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to go ahead and read a little bit of that. And we'd like to go ahead and talk about another really early example of expansionism, really one of the very first examples that sometimes is lumped in with this, and it actually occurs a little bit earlier in 1867. And it's something known as Sewards Folly. It's called Sewards Folly because the guy who orchestrated all of this was called William H. Seward. He was the Secretary of State at the time, and he arranged for the United States to purchase Alaska. We purchased it from Russia. and we paid a total of $7.2 million for all of Alaska. That's pennies on the acre. And when he made this purchase, he did it primarily for defensive reasons. He was following the Monroe the Monroe Doctrine, and which basically said we didn't want Europeans interfering on our side of the planet, and he was trying to get a European power out, Russia. The people of Washington thought he was crazy. Why on earth would you buy this piece of frozen tundra from Russia? They thought he was a fool. Thus the nickname Sewards Folly. How stupid can you be? He was almost laughed out of town because of this. And in fact, in the long term, it turned out to be an incredibly wise proposition. We eventually discovered gold in Alaska. A little bit later, we discover oil in Alaska. And try to imagine the Cold War, our conflict with Russia through the 60s and 70s, 80s, 50s even, with Russia having control of Alaska. So again, it turned out to be a very wise purchase, but at the time, everybody thought he was a fool. Other examples of expansionism that we're going to go ahead and discuss in this unit include the annexation of Hawaii, and we'll talk a little bit more about these things coming up in the next several days. The Spanish-American War, sometimes referred to as the Splendid Little War, the building of the Panama Canal, the story of how we came to control the Philippines and Puerto Rico, which is tied in with the Spanish-American War very much. We're going to examine certain foreign policies like the open door policy and dollar diplomacy, and all of these things would be examples of the United States expanding our influence all around the globe.